Welcome, friends. I understand from our professional staff that over 200 people have registered for this evening's program. So we're welcoming people from near and far to enjoy this presentation this evening. Our presentation, Why and How Do We Believe? The Psychology of Scientific and Religious Beliefs. We are honored to welcome Dr. Tania Lombrozo to the Haberman Institute community for the second talk in this fall's Psychology and Religion series. As a member of the Haberman Institute Board of Directors, I would like to extend a special welcome to all who are new to the Haberman Institute. Our mission is to deliver high-quality, in-depth encounters with Jewish thought, history, and culture, offering enriching discussions that resonate with and illuminate our lives through a uniquely Jewish lens. We invite you to learn more about Haberman Institute programs and classes by visiting our website, habermaninstitute.org. Our program lineup is packed with opportunities to learn together on a wide variety of topics, including our next talk coming up on Monday, December 2nd, about the hidden stories of Jewish Romania. This talk will be the first in a two-part series on Jewish Eastern European heritage, and we hope you will join us. On to tonight's program. Dr. Tania Lombrozo is a professor of psychology at Princeton University and an associate of the Department of Philosophy and the University Center for Human Values. She directs the program in cognitive science and co-directs Natural and Artificial Minds, a new research initiative at the intersection of cognitive science and artificial intelligence. She received her PhD in psychology from Harvard University in 2006 after receiving a Bachelor of Science degree in symbolic systems and a Bachelor of Arts degree in philosophy from Stanford University. Dr. Lombrozo's research aims to address foundational questions about cognition using the empirical tools of cognitive psychology and the conceptual tools of analytic philosophy. Her work focuses on explanation and understanding, conceptual representation, categorization, social cognition, causal reasoning, and folk epistemology. She is the recipient of numerous early career awards, including the Stanton Prize from the Society for Philosophy and Psychology, the Spence Award from the Association for Psychological Science, a Career Award from the National Science Foundation, and a James S. McDonnell Foundation Scholar Award in Understanding Human Cognition. She lives in Princeton, New Jersey with her husband and two daughters, and is currently writing a book on the psychology of explanation. We're looking forward to learning from you this evening, Dr. Lombrozo. Thank you for sharing your research and insights with us. The Zoom box is now yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the lovely introduction, and thank you so much to the Haberman Institute for inviting me. So let me first share my slides with you. All right. Well, welcome. Thank you so much for spending your Thursday afternoon or evening with me thinking about the nature of belief. What I'd like to do is share some research from my lab that I think speaks to broader questions about the psychology of scientific and religious beliefs, and I'd love to hear at the end about your own questions on this topic. So the topic I'll be talking about today, beliefs, has been a perennial topic of interest across a number of disciplines, including philosophy, psychology, and other social sciences. And I think this is in part because our beliefs seem to be so central to how we think of ourselves and our identity, to how it is that we reason, and to how it is that we act in the world. Now, for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to think about beliefs as basically being claims that we accept to be true. But even with this relatively straightforward definition, we can appreciate that the act of believing is really subtle and complex. And to illustrate this, I want to consider an example from literature. So this is a passage from a book by George Orwell, a 1935 novel called A Clergyman's Daughter. And in the scene I want to share with you, Mr. Warburton, who's a non-religious neighbor of the main character, is talking to Dorothy, who's the clergyman's daughter. And Mr. Warburton asks, "Do you believe in hell?" When I say believe, mind you, I'm not asking whether you believe it in some milk and water metaphorical way. I mean, do you believe it literally? Do you believe in hell as you believe in Australia? Now, I like this passage in part because at least I find it slightly humorous, but also because I think it illustrates the theme that I want to explore today, which is whether or not there might be different kinds of believing, right? Believing something literally as opposed to metaphorically, perhaps believing differently when the target of your belief is very abstract or concrete, when you have very direct, tangible evidence versus very indirect evidence, or perhaps no evidence at all, when you're dealing with something very mundane or something perhaps sacred or profound. So that's my question for today. Are there different varieties of believing? And if so, what are these varieties like? And in particular, do they tend to vary across the domains of science and religion? Now, I'm a psychologist and cognitive scientist. And so my approach to answering this kind of question is going to be to try to see whether or not we can use the tools of experimental psychology and related disciplines to figure out whether or not there are systematic differences between these kinds of flavors of believing and to see if we can characterize what some of those differences are. My plan for today is to follow a partially autobiographical path to how I ended up thinking about some of these questions myself. So I'm going to start out by telling you about a project that had to do not with belief per se initially, but with looking at the nature of scientific and religious explanations. And in particular, we were interested in scientific and religious explanations for ourselves and our place in the universe, which often the domain of both science and religion. This project led us to think about the relationship between the characteristics of these kinds of explanations and people's beliefs in those explanations. And that in turn led to a project which relates more directly to my introductory example, whether or not, if you think about beliefs that are perhaps religious or non-religious or that differ in other sorts of ways, whether or not they involve different kinds of believing, different sort of flavors of the believing process. So that's my plan. And I'm going to start with a project on scientific and religious explanations. And this, I want to acknowledge, comes from a larger body of work that I pursued with a collaborator, Telly DeVuti, who was then a postdoctoral scholar in my lab and is now a research director at Gallup. And we pursued a series of papers that had to do with the nature of scientific and religious explanations, as well as inquiry within these domains. And what I'm going to present to you today is just two of the studies that most directly motivate the main question for today. All right. So for many people, not for everybody, but for many people, science and religion both play really important roles in explaining the universe and our place within it. But quite plausibly, they play very different kinds of explanatory roles. So for example, scientific explanations might be first and foremost about serving what I'm going to call broadly epistemic goals. And this is a term that I'm borrowing from philosophy to refer to the aspects of scientific explanations or scientific practice that are concerned with characterizing something like knowledge or truth, right? So we might think that our scientific explanations are good when they're accurate, when they do a good job characterizing what the world is like, when they yield accurate predictions, and so on. But if we think about religious explanations, they often play a much broader range of psychological roles. So beyond perhaps trying to get us some forms of knowledge or truth, we might expect that religious explanations play a variety of non-epistemic kinds of roles. For example, they might play an important role in supporting moral behavior, in telling us practically how we ought to live, in forming social groups and defining the boundaries of social groups, in helping us regulate our emotions, and so on. So if this is right, then we might expect that scientific and religious explanations are going to, in general, tend to have very different kinds of properties and perhaps be evaluated in terms of different criteria, even when they're explaining the very same thing. So in the first study, we focused on existential explanations. So these were explanations in response to questions like, how did the universe come to exist? Why is there suffering in the world? And what happens after we die? And we focused on these kinds of questions because, at least in the population we're studying, many people will spontaneously offer both scientific and religious answers in response to these kinds of questions. And we wanted to see whether or not those differed in any systematic and interesting ways. Now, I should be careful in specifying who our population was for both this study and the subsequent studies I'm going to tell you about. So all the work I'm going to be talking about today comes from populations that were recruited in the United States. So these were adults who were recruited in various forms of online platforms, not necessarily a nationally representative sample, but we do tend to see that it reflects some aspects of the demographics of the United States. And so our sample tends to be predominantly Christian. We do see subsets of other religions, but typically not enough of them to be able to pull them out of our analyses and see whether or not, for example, Jewish participants or Muslim participants responded differently. So I'm going to be characterizing the general trends that we see in our population, which is largely an American and most commonly Christian population. All right. So when you pose these kinds of questions to this population, what you find is that some people will spontaneously give you scientific explanations, some people will spontaneously give you religious explanations, and some people will do a combination of both. So just to give you an example of what this looks like, if you ask people, why is there suffering in the world? One of our participants told us that this was because not everyone has the same access to resources and because some areas are more developed than others. And they went on to give what was basically an economic sort of explanation, a sort of social scientific explanation for why it is that there's suffering in the world. A different participant responded that the reason there's suffering in the world is because there is free will and God doesn't like suffering, but when man has free will, there will be suffering. And so what we found is that the participants offered all sorts of explanations of these kinds. We then presented these explanations back to another group of participants and asked them to classify the explanations as being scientific or religious. And so as a result of this process, we were able to create a large set of explanations that, at least by our participants' light, are either scientific and not religious or religious and not scientific, but nonetheless are answers to the same question. And so now we're in a position to ask our primary research question, which is whether and how these different bodies of explanations vary from each other. So our goal here, remember, was to see whether or not there's systematic differences as a function of the domain of the explanation, right? So even though these explanations are answers to the same question, they were classified as being scientific or religious. And we want to know if they vary in ways that we might expect based on the original motivating idea I introduced, that scientific explanations are going to tend to have certain kinds of epistemic goals. They're largely going to be about accuracy and descriptively characterizing the natural world, whereas religious explanations might additionally have a lot of other goals, perhaps social, moral, and so on. And so what we did is that we asked our participants to evaluate these explanations along a variety of dimensions that were designed to tap these epistemic and non-epistemic characteristics of explanations. So I'm not going to read you all of these because there were many, but I want to give you sort of a flavor for them. So for example, participants would be shown an explanation like one of the examples I showed you before, and they would be asked to tell us how much they agree with the statement that this explanation is based on evidence. We take that to be a sort of epistemic characteristic, whether or not it's grounded in evidence. They would tell us how much they agree that this explanation is right for some people, but it's not the right explanation for everybody. That would suggest that people don't take it to be an objective fact of the matter. They take it to be something more subjective, perhaps like an opinion. So that has an asterisk next to it, which psychologists use to indicate that this was reverse coded. So we sort of flipped this to be a measure of how objective people think something is. So if they disagree with this, that suggests that they think it's kind of like a fact of the matter or true for everybody. We had a variety of non-epistemic dimensions that we considered. Some of them are here, like this is the sort of explanation that brings people closer together. You might think of that as a social good. This explanation offers peace of mind. You might think of that as an emotional good. If everyone believed this, the world would be a kinder place. You might think of that as a moral good. So overall, we had several different kinds of categories of these epistemic and non-epistemic items that are indicated here on this figure. So we considered whether or not people think an explanation has good evidential and logical support and is objective to be epistemic characteristics. And then we had questions that were aiming to test aspects of whether people thought the explanation supported so social ends, emotional ends, supported your sense of self and identity, made the world a better place, and supported a sense of accountability. All right, so what I'm going to show you is what the average ratings were for this sort of collection of dozens of explanations that we collected from this population that were either scientific or religious explanations in response to these existential questions. And along the y-axis, what you're going to see is the mean level of agreement with each of these statements for the scientific versus the religious explanations. Okay, so if we look at the first category, for example, the extent to which people agreed that these explanations had evidential support. What you see is on average, scientific explanations are higher on evidential support. They're regarded as more objective. But when we look at the non-epistemic buckets of ratings, we see exactly the reverse. So for all of these categories, except for accountability, where we didn't see a difference, we find that on average, people give higher ratings to the religious explanations and the scientific explanations, along these non-epistemic dimensions, at the extent to which the explanations have moral, social, emotional value, and so on. Now, interestingly, the difference that you see here on the left in terms of the epistemic characteristics was driven overwhelmingly by the less religious subset of our sample. So among less religious participants, you see this differentiation between science and religion in terms of the extent to which they see them as objective and having evidential support. For the most religious participants, these yellow bars were higher and sort of reached the height of the blue bars so that there was no longer a difference. By contrast, these differences that you see on the right for the superior non-epistemic merits of the religious explanations, that was primarily driven by the more religious participants. So here, if you look at the less religious participants, for them, these yellow bars were lower and went down to the level of science. So we do see that how people rate these explanations do depend on their own religious beliefs. But overall, on average, we see this pattern of differentiation where what you see is that the scientific explanations are more associated with these sort of epistemic goods or epistemic merits, and the religious explanations are more associated with these non-epistemic values. Okay, so now we want to see how this relates to people's beliefs. And what we did here was that we generated 2 scientific and 2 religious explanations that were representative of the kinds of explanations our participants gave us in this sample. We chose these to vary in the extent to which they were frequently endorsed in this population so that we'd get some heterogeneity in how much people believed these. And the key measure was whether or not participants believed that this was true, right? So here's where we're sort of shifting from thinking about different kinds of explanations and their characteristics to how this translates to people's own beliefs. Participants would give us a 5-point rating about the extent to which they believe the explanation is true for whichever explanations they were presented with. Okay, so what I'm going to show you here along the x-axis is this 5-point rating that corresponds to the I believe this explanation is true statement that I just showed you. So a 5 would be that somebody strongly agrees. A 1 would be that they strongly disagree. And again, we had participants rate all of these explanations or whichever ones they were presented with along various epistemic and non-epistemic criteria, like the examples that I showed you. And so what we're interested in looking at here is what's the relationship between the extent to which people think a given explanation has these sorts of epistemic merits, like being supported by evidence, or non-epistemic merits, like being socially or morally good, and whether or not they take it to be true. And does this vary across science and religion? All right, so what I'm showing you here in the graph on the right is the relationship between people's strength of belief on the x-axis and the extent to which they attribute these non-epistemic characteristics, like being emotionally, socially, and morally good, for both scientific and religious explanations. And the first thing you should notice is that in both cases, there's a positive relationship, which I think makes sense intuitively. So the more strongly you believe this explanation is true, the more strongly you're inclined to say that it has moral value, social value, and so on. But you'll also notice that for every single level of belief, the yellow line for religion is higher than the blue line for science. And that means that even when you're looking at 2 explanations that are endorsed equally strongly, they're believed equally strongly, you're finding that on average, participants are attributing higher non-epistemic merits to the religious explanation than to the scientific explanation. When you look at the epistemic merits, you see exactly the reverse pattern. So again, overall, we see a positive association. The more strongly you believe something, the more likely you are to say that it's supported by evidence and logical, has these sorts of epistemic characteristics. But at every level of belief, we find that people attribute these properties more strongly to the scientific explanations than to the religious explanations. And here's where I think this starts to get more interesting. So suppose you look at a given level of belief, say belief level 4. So you agree that this explanation is true. You don't strongly agree, but you agree that this explanation is true. For a religious explanation, that corresponds to basically being at the middle of the scale in terms of whether or not you think you have evidence for it, think it's logical, and so on. But for science, that corresponds to being above that midpoint. Going the reverse direction, if you have a given explanation that has, say, 3.5 rating on average in terms of its epistemic credentials, that translates to a belief level of only 4 agreeing for science, but strongly agreeing for religion. Now, these findings are correlational, so we don't really know if one of these factors is causing the other or not. But I think one intuitive interpretation of these relationships is that people have different criteria or thresholds for evidence for accepting these scientific versus religious explanations. So for somebody to accept a scientific explanation, they hold it to a very high standard for how good the evidence has to be for it. But in order to accept a religious explanation, they're holding it to a lower evidential standard. Now, why are they doing that? It's plausibly because of what we see on the right. It's because they see the religious explanation as supplying all of these other virtues, all of these other good things beyond its evidential support, right? It has social and moral value. And so in some sense, that's compensating for lower evidential support, leading to a given level of belief. Okay, so some take-home lessons from this first part of the presentation. We see that on average, scientific and religious explanations are judged to have different sorts of virtues or positive characteristics. Scientific explanations tend to be rated more highly along these epistemic sorts of dimensions, like the strength of evidence, whether or not people regard them to be logical, and so on. Whereas religious explanations tend to be rated more highly along a variety of these non-epistemic dimensions. So, for example, promoting positive social, emotional, and moral ends. And on average, people seem to be holding these scientific and religious explanations to different evidential standards. So, one way to characterize this is that a scientific explanation requires stronger evidence, stronger epistemic sorts of credentials than a religious explanation in order to translate to a given level of belief. All right, so we see that these considerations supporting belief seem to differ across these different types of belief, and in particular, across the scientific versus religious explanations in response to these existential questions. And so this sets us up to ask the question I started with. So, are there different varieties of believing associated with these different kinds of beliefs? And what I want to do is take a few minutes to make this question a little bit more precise. So, let's start with the example from the beginning. We imagine that Dorothy Hare, this is the character from the Orwell novel. Let's suppose that she believes that hell is a real place, and she also believes that Australia is a real place. So what would it mean for these beliefs to be different? Well, of course, one way these beliefs are different is that they have different content, right? They're beliefs about different things. The first is a belief that hell is a real place. The second is a belief that Australia is a real place. Clearly, the content is very different. And so you might think that these beliefs differ, or that religious and scientific beliefs differ in general, purely because they tend to be about different content. Another possibility is that they're the same kind of believing, but really what differentiates them is just the strength of the belief. So in fact, there's been quite a lot of evidence looking at differences in strength of belief or confidence for scientific versus religious claims. People have looked at this in young children. They've looked at it in the United States. They've looked at it in other countries, including Iran and other places. And what you find across all of these populations fairly consistently is that people tend to be more confident in their scientific beliefs than in their religious beliefs. And so you could think that that's going to be the difference between these beliefs. Third possibility is that what's actually different across these cases, if there is a difference, is in the nature of the believing itself. And this is a difference in what philosophers would call a doxastic or a cognitive attitude, right? Just in the same way that, for example, if Dorothy suspects that hell is a real place versus Dorothy accepts that hell is a real place, that difference between acceptance and suspicions, suspecting versus accepting, that's a difference in the kind of attitude she has towards the content that hell is a real place. And similarly, you might think that even though we have the same word here, we're using the word believes in both cases, perhaps what's different across these cases is the nature of the believing itself, not just or in addition to differences in content or strength of belief. And that's really the hypothesis that I have in mind when I raise the question of whether or not there's different varieties of believing. Is there actually something different psychologically about the nature of the believing that occurs across cases like this? So, what might those varieties of believing be like? So, if you recall the distinction that I introduced from part one between these epistemic and these more non-epistemic dimensions of explanations, you'll understand the motivation for a particular hypothesis, which is that the flavor of this believing might differ depending on the kind of psychological role that this belief plays for somebody. There might be a kind of epistemic flavor of believing, which we can think of as a cognitive activity with a primary function of supporting accurate representations of the world for the purposes of successful prediction, intervention, and so on. You might expect this flavor of believing to overwhelmingly be based on evidence, to be very responsive to new evidence, and so on. But there might also be a kind of non-epistemic flavor of believing, and this would be a cognitive activity that serves other kinds of functions, in particular non-epistemic functions. For example, promoting social cohesion, emotion regulation, identity, promoting pro-social moral behavior, and so on. And so you might expect this flavor of believing to have different sorts of characteristics, be responsive to different kinds of inputs from the environment, and so on. So if this is true, this is a particular hypothesis about this difference coming down to the nature of the attitude itself, sort of the beliefs relation. And the empirical challenge is to show that there could be differences here in the believing that are not attributable to differences in content or to differences in strength. So often in psychology, this means that rather than looking at exciting examples that come from literature, we have to make up our own examples to allow us to experimentally control the variables that we want to look at. So for example, we can make sure that if we find differences, it's not due to content by having beliefs that have exactly the same content, right? So if we find differences between Dorothy believing that P and Dorothy believing that P, where that content is the same across cases, that gives us an opportunity to really isolate a difference in the cognitive attitude itself and know that it's not attributable to a difference in the content. In my presentation today, I'm just going to show you a subset of the data that we have addressing this because it gets complicated very quickly, but in the Q&A, I'm happy to bring up additional evidence. So what I'm going to focus on for today is just one indication that people might be applying a different sort of cognitive attitude in thinking about these cases. And that's going to be the use of the term believes versus thinks. So if you think for a moment, in English, we use both the term believes and thinks to express our commitment to the truth of some claim. Dorothy can believe that P, she can think that P, and so on. We also often use these as hedges to indicate some uncertainty. So if you're not sure it's Wednesday, you might say, I think it's Wednesday, I believe it's Wednesday. So we use these English terms in a lot of fairly interchangeable ways. But nonetheless, there's some evidence that there's systematic differences between the way that we use these terms that might track these differences in cognitive attitudes across these different kinds of cases. So let me show you some of that prior evidence, and then I'll show you how we've extended this in some recent work. All right, so I'm drawing on two published papers in particular that were published a few years ago. And what these papers did was try to characterize differences in the use of thinks versus believes. And one of their sources of evidence was looking at large corpora of text from different sources and saying what sorts of statements follow thinking or believing. And is it the case that you tend to see a preponderance of religious content after belief compared to thinks? And that is what they found. The experiment that I want to show you is the one that I think is the most well controlled, because what they did was come up with a way to see whether or not you get differences in the use of thinks versus believes, even when you're talking about a belief with the same content. So I'm going to give you one example of the kinds of vignettes that they showed their participants, and we'll see if we can get the kinds of intuitions that they generated in all of you. All right, so here is an example of one of their vignettes with a religious context. So all last year, Terry would get splitting headaches in the afternoons. Sometimes her friends would offer her aspirin, but Terry belonged to the Church of Christ Scientist, which teaches that prayer, not medicine, is the way to cure medical ills. So Terry always refused the aspirin her friends offered because she blanks that aspirin is not a cure. And now participants were invited to fill in the blank with either believes, because she believes that aspirin is not a cure, or thinks, because she thinks that aspirin is not a cure. If we weren't in a webinar, I would ask by show of hands, how many of you would use thinks or believes? Instead, I'll just invite you to consider how you would respond. Now, they both are grammatically completely fine in English, but you might feel that one of them seems more appropriate than the other. Okay, here's what they called the matter-of-fact context. So all last year, Carrie would get splitting headaches in the afternoons. Sometimes her friends would offer her aspirin, but Carrie had tried using aspirin many times in the past, and the headaches just kept happening, whether she took aspirin or not. So Carrie always refused the aspirin her friends offered because she blanks that aspirin is not a cure. And again, participants would be invited to fill in thinks versus believes. And you can consult your own intuitions. If you are like a majority of participants who were in this study, what you might find is that even though both words seem appropriate in both cases, you might feel more inclined to fill believes in the first context and thinks in the second context. And so that's what they found. In the first case, in the religious context, a majority of participants selected believes. And in the second case, a majority of participants selected thinks. This isn't something unique to these particular vignettes. So this was true across a variety of vignettes that had the same sort of structure, where in one case there was a sort of religious basis for the belief, and in the other case there was this more kind of mundane, factual, evidence-based reason for the belief. And it also doesn't seem to be unique to English. So one of the really nice things in this second paper that I cite here is that they replicated this across 5 different languages with very, very different cultural contexts. So it seems like, at least across many languages, there seems to be some sort of linguistic differentiation between these different flavors of believing that map onto something like think versus belief. And what's really nice about the way they designed this particular study, right, is that the content of the belief was held fixed, right? So across both of these cases, the content of the belief is that aspirin is not a cure. And nonetheless, despite holding that content fixed, you find this difference in the kind of believing that participants think is involved, as reflected in their use of the term thinks versus believes. Okay, so we wanted to use this method to see whether or not some of the ideas that I've introduced related to scientific and religious explanations might give us some insight into the nature of belief. And so you might think that in this matter of fact context, the example we saw with Carrie thinking the headaches didn't work, the headache medicine didn't work, is that this might involve a kind of epistemic flavor of believing, right? This cognitive activity with the function of supporting accurate representations of the world for prediction, intervention, and so on. Whereas in this religious context, these particular examples might have involved a non-epistemic flavor of believing, something that was more closely tied to social, moral, and emotional concerns. And so really, if that's the right characterization of this difference, then it's not really a difference in religious versus matter-of-fact contexts at all, but rather in this epistemic or non-epistemic kind of difference. And if that's true, the key characteristics of an epistemic context ought to be that the belief plays an epistemic role for people. It's about tracking the world, tracking the evidence. So you'd expect such beliefs to be based on evidence, to change in the face of new evidence, and to have the ultimate goal of being as accurate as possible. Whereas in these other contexts, you might expect beliefs to be based on non-epistemic considerations. So, for example, loyalty or what people consider to be morally good. It wouldn't necessarily be so responsive to evidence, and it would ultimately aim at some sort of non-epistemic good, like promoting moral behavior or supporting a friendship. So I'm going to give you an example in a moment of what this actually looked like, but I do want to acknowledge my collaborators. This was work pursued with Alejandro Vesga and Neil Van Leeuwen. And again, I'm just presenting a subset of quite a bit more data, but I'm presenting two studies to you tonight. All right, so in our first study, we used a sort of vignette paradigm, like you saw in the last study, where we're going to give people little stories and have them fill in thinks versus believes. And what that allows us to do is to have cases where people are stating whether or not a character thinks or believes, but holding the content fixed, which is really crucial in order to show there's a difference in the kind of believing involved, not just the content that somebody believes. And so we had lots of different vignettes. I'm just going to show you one example to illustrate the way we tried to manipulate whether or not this belief is playing a largely epistemic or kind of truth tracking role, or whether it's a belief that's also tied up with all of these social, moral, and other kinds of considerations. All right, so participants in both conditions would start out learning the same sort of background. For this particular vignette, the background is that Adam and John were best friends in their childhood and teenage years. However, after graduating from high school, John left to serve in Water Without Borders, a humanitarian program based in the global south. 10 years later, after traveling the world with the organization, John came back to his town and rebuilt his friendship with Adam, who'd never left. However, one day, Adam hears a rumor that John came back because he was stealing money from the organization he was working for. Adam has trouble accepting this because, and now here, different sets of participants would get different information. In the non-epistemic case, Adam has trouble accepting this because he wants to be a loyal friend to John. Sorry. Even if Adam were presented with strong evidence, he would have trouble accepting John's guilt. It would feel like wronging John. What's important to Adam is nurturing his friendship with John, and he wouldn't want to betray that. Given these feelings, Adam currently blanks that John did not steal money from the organization he was working for. So again, participants would fill this in with thinks or believes. You can take a moment to see if you have any intuitions one way or the other about how he would fill this in. All right, this contrasted with the epistemic condition. The first part of the passage was the same, but participants would then learn that Adam has trouble accepting this because it doesn't fit with what he knows about John. If Adam were presented with strong evidence, he would fully accept John's guilt. Ultimately, what's important to Adam is to accept whatever is true. But based on the evidence he has, Adam currently blanks that John did not steal money from the organization he was working for. So again, you can consult your intuitions. Is it that Adam currently thinks that John did not steal money or believes that John did not steal money in this case? Now, the key thing to focus on is across these cases, the content of the belief that people are evaluating is exactly the same, right? So we're holding the belief content fixed. And what we want to know is whether or not the flavor of the believing itself is different as reflected in their use of the term thinks versus believes. And we try to hold many, many things about these two conditions fixed across the epistemic and the non-epistemic condition. But the crucial things that we're varying are whether or not this person is indicated as being very responsive to evidence. They'd have trouble changing their mind or they would readily change their mind, what their main goal is, In one case, what's important is nurturing this friendship. In the other case, what's most important is accepting whatever's true and what their belief is based on. Over here, it's based on these feelings, and over here, it's based on the evidence that Adam currently has. All right, so what did we find? So as predicted, when participants were asked about the more natural way of completing the blank in sentences like the above across this vignette and several others that had similar structures, we found a significant difference across these conditions. So we actually found, in contrast to the earlier paper, and I can tell you why I think this is if you want, but overall, people were more inclined to say believes than thinks. There was just sort of a baseline preference for saying believes. But nonetheless, there was a significant difference across these conditions where participants were significantly more likely to say believes in the non-epistemic context than in the epistemic context where the character was mainly aiming at truth. And what I think this tells us is that participants' language use is sort of betraying a pretty subtle difference in the kind of belief that they are attributing to these characters across these cases as a function of the psychological role that that belief plays for that character. Now, we also asked participants to tell us how confident these characters were. So, for example, how certain do you think Adam is that John did not steal the money? And there was no difference in mean confidence across these cases. And that's important because remember, our goal is to see whether or not there's a difference in the nature of the believing involved, the attitude itself, not a difference in the belief content, which we've held fixed in these vignettes, and not just a difference due to something like confidence or certainty, which in this case we can measure and assess that that's not what's driving differences across conditions. Okay, so if there's a real difference between the way that people tend to use think versus believes, where that difference tracks the kind of psychological role that people think that the belief plays, right? That plays a more epistemic or non-epistemic kind of role, then you might expect people to be able to make a relatively subtle inference from people's language use to the role that a belief plays, right? So previously in the vignettes I showed you, we give people evidence that a belief plays a more epistemic or a more non-epistemic role. And then based on that difference, we see whether or not they use think versus believes. In this study, we're reversing the logic. We're going to have a character express a belief using either thinks or believes. And we want to see if that leads people to draw different inferences about the psychological role of that belief for that individual. So here's what this looks like. Participants were told a scenario like the following. So Alex and Blaine were both called by the same survey company. The survey company asked them each several questions. One question concerned their take on weather claim, and we had various claims. One of them was whether or not there's alien life in the universe. So, for example, one question concerned their take on whether there's alien life in the universe, and here's what they each said. Alex said, "I believe that there's alien life in the universe." Blaine said, "I think that there's alien life in the universe." All right, so again, we have two characters. They're expressing beliefs with the same content, but one of them is using the word believe to express this. The other one is using the word think to express this. And the question is, does this quite subtle difference in language give you any evidence about the nature of their belief, right? The kind of flavor of believing that's involved here. And in particular, whether that flavor of believing is mostly just about having an accurate representation of the world, mostly kind of an epistemic form of believing, or is it also tied up with sort of social, emotional, moral, identity-based kinds of considerations? All right, so we had 5 different claims that we considered just to make sure that if we find anything, it's a generalizable result. These were selected because they were all claims that we thought that participants would plausibly think could be held in this more epistemic or non-epistemic kind of flavor of believing. And what we were interested in was whether or not when a character says that they think the claim is true, do people think that that person's belief is based on evidence, would change if they encountered counter evidence and aims at truth? Whereas for the character who says that they believe the claim, they're more likely to think that it might be based on non-epistemic considerations, would not change in the face of contrary evidence, and aims at non-epistemic values. So what we did is we asked them a variety of questions, and we asked them whether they thought it was more likely to describe Alex or Blaine. Remember, one of these is the character who described things in terms of thinking that P, one of them described in terms of believing that P, right? Really subtle difference. But are we going to see a systematic difference in the kinds of inferences that participants draw? So one of the questions was, do you think, so we told them that one of these characters was more interested than the other in basing their view on evidence. We asked them, who do you think is the person who was most interested in basing their view on the evidence? And they give us a rating that ranges from definitely it was Alex to definitely it was Blaine. Okay, the way I'm going to show you the data drops the Alex and Blaine because that gets confusing. And instead of the character who happened to say thinks and the character who said believes. And what you can see is that in response to this question, the majority of participants represented by these dots, with the mean indicated here, sort of this reddish circle, the majority of these participants thought that it was more likely that it was the character who expressed their belief would think, who was interested in basing their view on the evidence. As in the previous study, we also asked participants who they thought was more confident in the claim, and this difference persists even if you take that into account. We asked them who they thought was the person who's more likely to change their mind if they were presented with evidence indicating that it's not the case that there's alien life in the universe. Again, we find that people think the thinks character is more likely to be responsive to evidence in this way than the character who expresses their commitment using the term believe. And who do you think is the person who's more interested in having true and accurate beliefs about the world? Again, participants think the character who indicated thinks is more likely to have this interest than the one who indicated their belief using the term believe. All right, so some take-home lessons from part 2. People tend to differentiate between beliefs that play these predominantly epistemic roles and those that play predominantly non-epistemic roles, including social, moral, emotional, and so on. And they do this even when the beliefs share the same content and are held with the same confidence. And so that's what really gives us evidence that we're characterizing something like a different attitude or a different flavor of believing. And one way that such beliefs are differentiated, at least in terms of everyday communication, is in the use of the terms thinks versus believes. We also find that people can make this relatively subtle inference in the reverse direction, right? So when you hear a belief expressed using the term thinks versus believes, that might lead you to draw different inferences about the nature of the believing that that person is engaged in. And so one sort of implication of this, which I think is sort of interesting, is that when we're keeping track of other people's beliefs in the world, it seems like we're sensitive to this distinction, not just of what they believe, what the content is, but something about the way in which we think that they believe it. And I think part of the reason why that's important is because that has implications for whether or not we think that it would be fruitful to try to persuade them, what sorts of strategies might be effective if we were to try to persuade them, how it is that that belief will or won't guide their actions, how important it is to them, and so on. All right, so if we return to our overarching hypothesis, I think we have some evidence for different varieties of believing. Of course, beliefs also differ in terms of their content and their strength. But when we try to hold those things fixed in these carefully controlled sorts of experiments, we find that people are also sensitive to this difference in attitude, where one way to characterize that difference in attitude is that there's a flavor of believing, which involves all of these non-epistemic kinds of considerations, so social, moral, emotional concerns, and so on. But there's also sort of like a thinner notion of believing, which is more narrowly concerned with just accurately describing the world. I want to end with 2 important qualifications on this point before zooming out briefly. So one is I've talked about these as different kinds of beliefs or believing, but my view is that there's certainly going to be some area of overlap. There's going to be beliefs that play both of these kinds of roles, or that sort of fall at different places in the spectrum in terms of how important these different kinds of roles are. A lot of the beliefs that we hold because we're quite confident they're true might also be beliefs that we think are very morally and socially important, and vice versa. So this is not meant to be 2 mutually exclusive categories, but rather pointing out that beliefs vary in their predominant psychological roles and that that has consequences for how we track other people's beliefs and the kinds of inferences that we make about them. Second qualification is that I don't think this has a one-to-one correspondence to scientific versus religious beliefs. So we started out looking at religious versus scientific explanations, and we saw evidence for this think-believe difference, predominantly in the context of religious versus non-religious sorts of claims. But really what I think is doing the work there is whether or not a belief plays these more epistemic or non-epistemic kinds of considerations. I do think it's true that on average, religious beliefs do play many non-epistemic roles for people. And so I think the space of religious beliefs might be sort of skewed towards the non-epistemic, but this does not preclude the possibility that some religious beliefs are going to involve 100% the sort of epistemic flavor of believing, and that you're going to see a lot of room between those. It also doesn't preclude the possibility of scientific beliefs playing these non-epistemic sorts of roles. And I think one place where we see this in sort of a problematic way, actually, is in terms of people's beliefs about anthropogenic climate change, right? So it seems like a belief like whether or not humans play a causal role in leading to climate change is a sort of thing which is just an objective fact of the matter. It's either true or false. It ought to be based on evidence. It's just describing a feature of the world. And so you might think it should be a canonical example of a non-epistemic belief. But in fact, what's happened, at least in the United States and some other countries, is that it's taken on these additional sorts of social and political connotations where what you believe about climate change can indicate something important about your political affiliations, about your views on certain kinds of policies, and so on. And so it's a belief that's come to take on a lot of these additional non-epistemic kinds of roles. And as a result, we might expect that, at least for some people, it's going to have a profile that looks more like some religious beliefs than it is like canonical scientific beliefs. So the more general take-home lesson um, for the talk is that I think our beliefs play many different kinds of psychological roles. I mean, we often think about beliefs as being about just describing what the world is like, but they also play incredibly important roles in terms of creating social relationships, regulating our emotions, promoting moral behavior, and so on. And these different kinds of functional roles might be better supported by different flavors of believing. So I think the positive lesson there is that we have a great deal more cognitive flexibility when it comes to belief than maybe has been appreciated by some views of belief. And that's going to be good insofar as we want to be able to serve all of these roles. But there's also some dangers there in mistaking some beliefs that play some roles for sort of the wrong kind of belief, right? So, for example, if I were to tell you that I believe that my kids are the best kids in the world, which of course I do, I think they are. And you responded by saying, well, is that really based on a lot of evidence? Do you think that's the most logical belief that you could hold? I would sort of feel like you missed the point, right? I was expressing a non-epistemic belief, and you're coming back at me with criteria for epistemic belief. And so I think there's a lot of potential for crosstalk across people, and also for certain kinds of persuasive attempts to be ineffective if we fail to appreciate the kind of belief that somebody is holding and that the role that that belief is playing for them psychologically. So I will stop there, thanking you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions.
Yeah, okay, okay. Oh, Professor, thank you so very, very much. Um, it we live in a time where thinking and believing is really important to distinguish, and yet it's really for some, I think, difficult to refine the thinking. There are a number of questions along the lines of trying to clarify, comparing something you believe with something you think. Uh, why is this not like apples and oranges? What the example is, Australia is a place. You can go there. We can.
Mm-hmm.
Hell is, uh, according to one questioner, is only in one's mind. I guess
Mm.
sort of supposes that in whose mind? Can you elaborate on that just a little bit? So that, because that was such a great example, maybe if a little elaboration will help get us all get greater clarity.
Right. I mean, I think what one important point to make is that the way one um, evaluates this is going to depend on whether or not one shares the belief or not, right? So if you're somebody who doesn't believe in hell, then you might be inclined to say that's only in your mind, or that's made up, or that's a cultural invention, whereas Australia is a real place that you can buy a flight to and visit. But for somebody who actually believes that hell is a real place, I think even in that case, we can ask the question, well, is for that person who would assert that they believe both, is the nature of their believing different?
Mhm.
And I don't think it'll be different for everybody, but I think for some people, it will be very different. And it could be different because of the nature of the evidence they have. In one case, maybe they visited Australia. In the other case, they have only indirect or no evidence for hell. But the difference that I want to point to is a little bit more subtle, but I think actually in some ways more important. It's that these beliefs play really different roles for the believer. So the belief about Australia is going to affect um, things like if you ask them where do you want to go on vacation, whether or not they list Australia is going to depend on whether or not they think Australia is a real place, right? But the belief about hell is going to play a lot of other roles for this person too. For example, it might govern what kind of behavior they think is good to engage in versus not, who they consider to be part of their community versus not. It might be something that, I mean, I think in the case of hell, probably is not very emotionally comforting, perhaps for people who do believe in heaven or a positive afterlife. It might be a comforting belief and so on, right? So the thought is that whereas the Australia belief, affects your factual guesses about what's true about the world and your actions that depend on what's true about the world, that sort of religious belief, typically for many religious believers, plays all of these other roles too. In fact, I'd want to say, but this is now getting more controversial, I'd want to say its main role for that person is not about accurately describing what the world is like. Its main role for people is about governing their social, emotional, and moral lives. And as a result of that very big psychological difference in the role that these beliefs are playing for people, the flavor of the believing itself is going to be importantly different. So that's really the distinction I want to point to, that different beliefs play different roles in our lives. And because of those differences in the roles in our lives that they play, they actually psychologically involve different kinds of believing that are going to manifest in many ways. And the way I showed you today was this sort of subtle difference in language about think versus believe, but that's just sort of like a device we can use as psychologists to try to figure out, are people really thinking about this differently? And this difference in language use suggests, yes, they actually are thinking about these differently, even if they're not consciously aware of the fact that they're doing so.
Thank you. I think you have some colleagues listening in, so I'm going to ask you one technical question on their behalf. And the question is formulated this way. When you, Professor, were formulating your hypothesis tests, what level of significance for an alpha were you using?
Okay, yeah.
0.05 or 0.1?
So these are all significant at the p-value of 0.05, for those of you who know what that is. And since this person is presumably knowledgeable about and interested in statistics, I'll mention these studies were also all pre-registered. So the analyses and the directions of the predictions.
And I hope those who pose the question are
Know what that meant.
got that. And in rabbinics, we say hamevin yavin. Those who understand, understand. So thank you for that technical question. Um, there are a couple of others that I think are also important. Do you find that people, in terms of behaviors, do you find that people who are more timid tend to believe more than think? And I don't know what
Oh,
is suggested by timid necessarily, but I suppose the question is, I personally would understand if you want to be careful here. Uh, do you find that difference in persons' personality types, let alone other types of groupings, between persons who are comfortable with the term believing as opposed to the term thinking?
yeah, that's a great question. And I don't have the data that speaks to that. And as far as I know, the field as a whole doesn't have the data yet to speak to that. Um, what we do know is that there are differences across types of beliefs in which flavor of believing tends to be involved. And to some extent, we have evidence for variation across people in this, but not for thinks versus beliefs specifically. So, in terms of thinks versus beliefs, uh, there is some evidence that, for example, if you take political claims, you might sort of wonder, where does that fall? If people tend to use belief or religion and they tend to use think for these sort of more like mundane scientific kinds of claims, where might other domains fall? And one of the papers that I mentioned found that political claims tended to fall sort of in between, which I think is consistent with the idea that they might play different roles for different people, right? So for some people, certain political beliefs might hold those beliefs just the same way they hold the belief that uh, tomorrow will be Friday, or that there's a 50% chance that this coin will land heads. But for other people, they might be beliefs that are actually closely related to their identity and that they're really invested in along other dimensions as well. In terms of variation across people, one of the other, today I talked about the difference between using the word think versus believe. We have other sort of signatures that we've identified that seem to track the flavor of believing that somebody is engaged in a particular case. And one of those signatures is whether or not people find it natural to express a belief in probabilistic terms. So I'm going to see if I can generate the intuitions in you. So suppose we have a case like the case where Adam believes that John is innocent of a crime. So suppose that Adam believes that John is innocent of the crime. Adam believes this based on the balance of evidence. In fact, Adam would say that there's a 90% chance that John is innocent. So there, what I did is I stated a belief, and then I restated it in terms of probabilities. There's a 90% chance. And hopefully that seemed pretty natural. But now let's contrast it with a case where Adam believes that John is innocent. Adam believes that John is innocent out of loyalty to John. In fact, Adam would say there's a 90% chance that John is innocent. So I don't know if that seemed a little bit jarring, but like it's a little strange if he believes that out of loyalty to then describe the belief as 90% likely to think that he's innocent. And it's not just that about the number itself. So we could say 99% likely, but there's something weird to say, like, I trust you. I trust you entirely. I think there's a 99% chance that you're innocent. Right. It sort of seems like there's something strange about characterizing a belief probabilistically when it's serving these non-epistemic kinds of roles. And so we find that that differs systematically across the kinds of vignettes that I showed you. And for that, we do find that there's variation across people and the extent to which they're prone to characterize beliefs in these more probabilistic sorts of terms. And I don't know how it relates to timidness per se, but I will say that we have a little bit of evidence that it might relate to recognizing the uncertainty associated with your beliefs and recognizing the possibility that you could be wrong. And I don't think I describe those as timid per se, but I would describe those as sort of like good epistemic kinds of characteristics in terms of the attitude that you have towards your beliefs.
Well, alluding to the possibility that a belief or an opinion held as a thought could be proven wrong, there is a question here that posed in this way. Is it important in terms of the impact of in this case, the belief, the importance of the truthfulness of the belief? What are the consequences if the belief is found to be contrary to the truth? And truth here is put in quotations.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the prediction would be that people are going to be much more resistant to belief change for the beliefs that are held in the believe way than the think way. We have a little bit of indirect evidence for this from other studies. So I have another set of studies that I didn't talk about, where we asked people to tell us about some of the characteristics of scientific and religious beliefs. And one thing that's interesting is that you can, if you ask people about several of their scientific beliefs and several of their religious beliefs, you can get two claims, one scientific and one religious, that the person holds equally strongly. Right. So, for example, on a 7-point scale, they give this scientific belief over here a 6 out of 7, and this religious belief over here a 6 out of 7. So we know they hold these beliefs equally strongly. And we could ask them additional questions like, well, how open are you to revising that belief? And you might think that if you hold two beliefs equally strongly, you ought to be equally open to revising the beliefs, but that's not what we find. What we find is that on average, people are much more open to revising scientific beliefs than religious beliefs, even when you match them for how strongly they're held. And they also will report that the religious belief is more important to them than the scientific belief, at least for the ones that we queried. And so I think that's interesting because it suggests that there might be something stickier about the beliefs that we believe as opposed to merely think are true. And I think that makes sense if those beliefs are more tied up to our identity, if they play multiple roles for us, besides just trying to give us an accurate characterization of the world.
Can we, a question that essentially flips the coin here.
Mm-hmm.
Have you studied disbelief? Is it symmetrical with the implications of the positive thinks believes dichotomy?
Yeah, I'll tell you the closest we've come. So to a large extent, whenever I've told you about an association going in one direction, right? If you describe it going in the other direction, it's kind of characterizing the effects of disbelief or non-religiosity when we look at religiosity. I'll tell you the most interesting version, I think, of that we have from our studies. So I mentioned in the first set of studies that we looked at the typical characteristics of religious versus scientific explanations. And we found that on average, people think the scientific explanations are great along epistemic dimensions and the religious are great along non-epistemic dimensions. So we did another experiment where we just told people basically, well, give us an epistemically good explanation. I mean, we didn't use those words. What we said was, could you please provide an explanation in response to a question like, why is there suffering in the world? Please try to give us an explanation that's based on evidence and that's very logical. So we sort of said, give us something that's epistemically good. We told other participants, give us something that's non-epistemically good. We said something like, give us an explanation that really offers peace of mind. And I think maybe we had reduces anxiety. I can't remember, but basically we were sort of encouraging people to do different kinds of explanations. Now, religious participants will typically give you a scientific explanation when you say, or often give you a scientific explanation when you say, give me something evidence-based and logical. And they will often give you a religious explanation when you say, give me something comforting. And part of what we were interested in is what do the non-religious participants do, right? So you have somebody who doesn't have at their disposal some of these traditional religious beliefs in order to offer a comforting explanation. What are they going to do? And what we found is that actually people were pretty good at coming up at what we called naturalistic sources of comfort. So, for example, if you were asked to give a sort of like comforting explanation that offers peace of mind for what happens after you die, people would talk about the fact that we live on in people's memories, that we have an impact on the world that extends beyond beyond our life, and so on. And so they would come up with ways to, in fact, be comforting, but without resorting to supernatural or religious beliefs. Um, so I think that that suggests that there's religious beliefs don't have a sort of monopoly on satisfying these non-epistemic ideals. I think there's going to be lots of humanistic alternative ways to do it. But, I think in fact, if we look across cultures and across time, one of the main tools that humans have relied on in order to satisfy some of these non-epistemic aims has been religious beliefs.
Could you, since we've been playing so delicately with these two words, um, we have a question that inquires about where does the theory of semantics enter into using the distinctions between believing and thinking?
Yeah, that's a great question. So inevitably, our results to some extent reflect this, the semantics of the term think versus believe. Um, our main goal in these studies is not to actually characterize those semantics. It's just to take advantage of the fact that there does seem to be some systematic difference in how people use those terms in order to see whether or not people differentiate across these epistemic and non-epistemic contexts. So from my perspective, it's a convenient indicator that people are actually differentiating these kinds of cases. There is interesting work from linguistics and psycholinguistics that tries to characterize more the semantics of these terms, and there are some subtle differences. But in a lot of ways, they're very similar, at least in English. And as I mentioned, there are some analogs in other languages as well.
There are a couple of questions here that have to do with different meanings of canonical truth.
Mm.
Um, I'm going to break them into two. One is canonical in the sense of religious, meaning that we have a scriptural teaching, whether it's of Jewish source, biblical source, Quranic source. I'm going to try to generalize this and keep it from being overly specific. Um, uh, and people say, I believe. How I guess the question here is how does this how would you apply this research to these to those I guess persons who are connected to religious traditions when confronted with challenge this scholarship, biblical criticism or textual criticism of any scripture, or the archaeological evidence that addresses history addressed by the scripture, that challenges the traditional beliefs of those communities.
Right.
How
So,
I'm quiet now.
no, I was going to say that is a big and important question. And I think I can only address a little piece of it. But the piece of it that I think this research speaks to is that we would expect people to be differentially responsive to that kind of evidence, depending on the psychological role that that belief is playing for them, and whether it's a more epistemic or non-epistemic belief. So if somebody holds a belief based on religious authority, so for example, a textual source or a religious figure who they trust, and the role that that belief plays for them is largely a social or moral or identity based role. It is important to them because it tells them something about their group membership. It signals to their community what they value. If that's the main role that that belief plays for them, then it's going to be pretty far on the non-epistemic side. And something like archaeological evidence might be irrelevant. I mean, this is not a perfect analogy, so I sometimes hesitate to use it. But suppose you had a belief like, I think chocolate ice cream is the best ice cream. And you come to me and you say, oh, but pistachios are really delicious and they have all of these great nutrients. And pistachio ice cream, it has these fantastic properties. I'm going to say, like, okay, fine, but what does that have to do with the fact that I think chocolate is the best ice cream? It just feels like it's not relevant to the nature of what I mean and what I'm committed to when I say chocolate is the best ice cream. Now, I don't think that's a perfect analogy for some of these religious commitments. I don't think people treat them as mere preferences. But I think there is that kind of mismatch where when a belief is playing a certain kind of role for you, that's going to affect what sorts of evidence experiences are going to seem relevant to you for changing that belief, and archaeological evidence might just not be relevant for you. On the other hand, if the religious authority you trust suddenly said something different, I mean, that's going to be relevant for that belief. And I'm going to say, vice versa for somebody who believes something, so you have a historical scholar who's interested in looking at certain kinds of archaeological evidence, and somebody says, oh, but here's what this religious authority says. That might not be relevant to this person because they don't regard that person as being relevant to what's most likely to be true about the archaeology. So I think there's a way in which the reason why somebody believes something is going to affect their sensitivity to these different kinds of evidence. And I think there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity in these cases, right? I definitely do not mean to suggest that all religious people believe in the same way. So, you can have, even within a given religious community, you can have a lot of diversity in how people are engaged in these different kinds of beliefs. And the prediction of the evidence that I've suggested today and the way I'm thinking about it is that that's going to systematically relate to which kinds of evidence they are or are not responsive to.
Let me flip this now to the other type of canonical truth. I think that was a term that you used in exploring uh, opinions about climate change.
Mm.
And the question here is, um, for example, the people when confronted, I'm going to use the language here and see if we can both understand it. People uh, confronted with the issue of climate change, people then confront the opposing faction with belief as being less scientific and less true, and think as more true and valid. I guess it means that
Mm.
I believe climate change is true, or I think it's not. I guess is the
Okay.
somehow the question supposes that there are instances in which the implied significance of believe and think can be flipped.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I do think there's going to be other factors that affect how people use, believe, and think. Um, I think somebody commented on this in the question. If you looked at that bar I showed you where we find significant differences between believe and think, it's not 0% versus 100%, right? It's something like, I don't know, 60% versus 75%, right? We're finding it's a modest difference. And that reflects the fact that there's some signal there. We get some evidence about how people are thinking based on their use of think versus believe, but lots of other things are going to influence think versus believe as well. I haven't personally come across a systematic flip like that. So if that's a feature of climate change discourse, I'd be really interested to look at that. I haven't personally come across it. The one case I am more familiar with where I've seen some discussion about this was more, I guess it's now almost 2 decades ago when there was more controversy about intelligent design creationism. And
Hmm.
one thing that many people are careful about in the context of science communication is whether or not they say that they believe evolution or they believe that humans uh, evolved through natural selection. And people are sometimes careful to avoid that, I think, in part because of these sorts of implications of belief, but also because part of what it means to believe our current best science is to have an attitude that is going to be responsive to new evidence, right? And so people sometimes prefer the term accept. I accept evolution as our current best explanation, but I also know how science works and that things might change. And if we get new evidence, I'm going to change my beliefs accordingly. And so I think part of the reason why science communicators in that context were very careful about using beliefs was because it seems to not have those kinds of scientific attitude implications. It seems to have a different sort of implication. So that surprises me in terms of what the questioner is suggesting is happening with climate change. And I guess, as I said, I haven't seen that personally, but I'd be really interested to dig into that if it's happening.
As someone who was involved in some of those controversies about creationism, even
Mm.
creation, evolution be attacked because we use the word theory.
Hmm. Yeah.
And theory implies a flexible truth in the sense that it's open to being tested and
Mhm.
revised, and the suggestion, therefore, that then the theory is not true, meaning fixed and firm and unvariable, uh, which I think also is occupies some of that same think believe space. And in relationship to that, do there's I'm wondering, question asks, do different ways of knowing show up in the brain when you think
Yeah.
or believe? When you think or do you believe, does an MRI light up differently?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm actually involved in a collaboration now where we hope to answer that. So I hope to have a better answer for you in a year or so. There have been a couple of existing studies where people have done brain imaging studies comparing religious beliefs, and they do find some differences. But as is the case with most brain imaging, you don't find, there's one area for religious belief and a different area for other kinds of belief, but you do find that there seems to be some more emotional involvement in certain kinds of religious beliefs. And you do find that other kinds of variation in the extent to which people have, hoping I'm remembering the data correctly, yeah, but the extent to which they feel they have sort of like a more personal relationship to God and to their religious belief sometimes manifests in some differences. So you do find differences like that. You also find some differences between, say, political beliefs and other kinds of beliefs, between moral beliefs and other sorts of beliefs. So it does look like some of the kinds of variations and flavors of believing that I think my work is trying to characterize do seem to have certain kinds of neural correlates.
I just want to say that we just have we're entering the final moments of our time uh, with Professor Lombroso, and so if there are any questions remaining, now's the time to ask them. We do have a few. Uh, there's a question here, Professor, that asks that if a person is prepared to make profound sacrifices uh, because of his religious or group teachings, have been uh, have been very strongly impressed upon him or her. Uh, is that act to be based, do you think that act is solely based on belief? Or does, given the question used here, the question uses the term indoctrination.
Mm,
Does that, is any thinking involved in his decision or
mm.
decision predicated solely on belief?
Um, so I think this gets at a broader question that is really important, which has to do with the relationship between beliefs and behavior. And so, in some ways, there's a very tight connection between beliefs and behavior. We do a lot of the things we do because of what we believe. And this is true of very mundane cases. The reason I opened the cupboard was because I thought that's where the chocolate was, right? So I can explain my behavior in terms of my belief. But then there's all sorts of mismatches between our behavior and our belief as well, right? So probably most of us believe that it'd be better to eat the salad than the chocolate cake, but a lot of us will still eat the chocolate cake. And that's because lots of things influence our behavior besides our beliefs. And I think the questioner is getting at a very extreme version of that because it's such an extreme behavior to be willing to sacrifice your own life or make some huge sacrifice yourself. So in those kinds of cases, I think probably having certain kinds of beliefs might be necessary, but I do not think it's sufficient. I think there's going to be a lot of other influences that are going to be playing a role, influences that have to do with social norms, social pressures, what the cost benefit analysis is like for that person for different kinds of actions. And I think that is going to involve an important kind of thinking. I think a lot's going to be involved in those cases, and it's much too simple to assume anything like a one-to-one correspondence between belief and behavior.
As, that segues, I think, beautifully into perhaps what we'll consider, Professor, to be your closing observation. This is a very simply worded question, and it queries what do you think are the applications of your research in the world today, given the issues that we contend with intellectually, spiritually, socially?
Yeah, that's a question that I definitely think about. I've been thinking about it a lot in the last couple of weeks in light of US politics. Um, I think that one hope I have is that we could have a better appreciation for the different kinds of beliefs that people hold, and that those beliefs can have legitimate and good values for them without mistaking all of those commitments that they hold for factual beliefs about the world. Right. So, for example, if I take my example that I think my kids are the best kids in the world, um, I don't think I'm confused about the status of that belief. I know that when I say that, I'm expressing something that's really important to me about my values, but that I'm not making a factually true claim that I intend to be part of our shared reality. And that ought to guide our, shared decision making. I recognize it's something that's sort of my values that I've expressed a particular way. And I think if people had a vocabulary for recognizing that things can be valuable without necessarily having to have the status of being factual claims about the world, maybe we'd be able to have somewhat more sophisticated discussions where people wouldn't have to bundle together their views about certain political ideologies with whether or not humans are responsible for climate change, right? If we could sort of separate the things that are meant to just be just factual claims that ought to be constrained by evidence from other sorts of claims, which are not illegitimate or unimportant, but that are not just constrained by our shared evidence, but play other kinds of roles. I wonder if we could maybe have more sophisticated conversations. I think that's a slightly naive hope, but nonetheless, it's a hope that I hold on to.
Well, I think it's probably a hope that we all share with you. And on behalf of all those in attendance tonight, and with appreciation for your scholarship as well as your insights into the dynamics of our own beings as well as our communities. I want to thank you, and thank you for joining the Haberman Institute this evening.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to the audience for great questions.
Yeah, I also want to reiterate what Rabbi Luxemburg just said, and thank you for this very fascinating and lecture and answering beautifully all of these very insightful questions. So I appreciate that, and I'm sure our audience does. So thank you, and thank you all out there for joining us. I hope to see you again soon.